In this video, we're going to get a little bit more familiar with the React library itself. To get started, I'm going to find my src directory inside my code editor. Inside there is the screens directory. Inside the screens directory, I'm going to make a new file called components_screen.js. And you'll notice that at the very top of my code editor right here, I have some breadcrumbs. You can use this little list right here to always tell what file I'm working on inside of our project directory. So inside of this components_screen.js file, we're going to create something called a React component. The goal of a React component is to show some amount of content to the user. We place these different React components that we create inside of different files inside of our project directory. In general, every different component file we create is going to have the same 4 different parts. And we're going to write out these same 4 different parts an incredible number of times throughout this course. So you're going to memorize these 4 different parts very quickly. In part 1, we're always going to write out a little bit of code to import some libraries that we need to actually create a component. In part 2, we're going to create the component itself. A component, for right now, we're going to use this definition. A component is a function that returns something called JSX. JSX is some special syntax that looks kind of like HTML. We'll expand on exactly what JSX is later on, but for right now, just understand that it is this JSX stuff that really tells React Native what we want to show on the screen of our mobile device. In part 3, we're going to create something called a style sheet. This style sheet works in a similar fashion to how a style sheet or CSS works inside the browser. It is used to add some styling or layout to the component that we created during part 2. And then finally, in part 4, we're going to export the component that we created during part 2 so we can use it somewhere else inside of our project. So let's try to create our own component inside this file that we just created a second ago. So we're going to write out some code inside of here. You're going to get very familiar with this code very quickly because we're going to write it all out an incredible number of times. All right, so inside of here, I'm going to first import 2 libraries that we need to create a component. So I'm going to import React from React, and then I'll import text and style sheet from React Native like so. Now, there's 3 things I want to mention very quickly about these 2 lines of code. First off, you'll notice that as soon as I write these 2 lines, they kind of fade out from view. That's just because I've not actually referenced the variables that I just imported. If I actually hover over these lines, it'll say that I declared this variable, but I never actually used it inside this file, and that's why it fades out. If I make use of that variable, it's then going to light up right away. So if you ever see a line of code inside of my editor that is kind of faded, that just means that we have not made use of it yet. Next up, you'll notice that we've imported something from a library called React and something from a library called React Native. These really are 2 separate and very different libraries. The React library is all about how different components work together. So usually when we create an application, we're going to assemble many different components to actually build our app. The React library has a ton of code inside of it that knows how to make different components work together. The React Native library, on the other hand, knows how to take some information from those components and use it to actually show some content on the mobile device. So each library has its own separate job. The other thing, or last thing, third thing that you'll notice about these 2 lines is that on the first line, we added in no curly braces, but on the second one, we did add in some curly braces. So the difference here is that on the first line, we are importing the entire React library into this file. On the second line, we are importing 2 very small pieces of the React Native library. So these curly braces means that we want to import just 1 or more very small parts out of a given library. And like I said, in this case, we want to import 2 different things, one thing called text and another one called style sheet. In general, throughout this course, I'm going to tell you exactly when we need to use curly braces and when we don't, and over time, you'll come to learn these rules on your own. Okay, so that's part 1. We've now imported some libraries that we're going to use to create a component. So now in step 2, or part 2, we're going to actually create our component, and that is a function that's going to return some amount of JSX. So right here, I'm going to create a new function using the const keyword. I'll call it components screen. So that's the name of my component. I'm then going to assign it a function like so. Throughout this course, for all of our different components, I'm going to generally be using arrow functions, but you could just as well use a keyword function instead. There's no effective difference for most of the work that we're going to be doing between using a keyword function or an arrow function. I just like to use arrow functions because they stylistically look a little bit nicer to me. So then inside of here, as we just mentioned, our function is going to return some amount of JSX. And as a reminder, JSX looks a lot like HTML, and it tells React Native what we want to show on the screen of our device. So in this case, I'm going to return a text element like so. So this HTML-looking stuff is JSX. This tells React Native that we want to show some amount of text to the user. The text that we want to show will be placed in between those two tags. So maybe for right now, I'll print out something like, this is the components screen, like so. And then I'll add on a semicolon to the very end of the line. This semicolon is not strictly required, but in general, I add in semicolons everywhere that you're supposed to add them in, even though for React, it doesn't technically make a difference. We could leave that off and leave off the semicolon at the end of the function as well. Okay, so we've now created our first component right here. Now the part 3 that we're going to go through, we're going to create something called a style sheet. Remember, a style sheet is just like a style sheet inside the browser. It is used to apply some amount of styling to our component that we just created. So in our case, we're going to create a style sheet, and we're going to try to create a new style that is going to change the font size of that text element. So to do so, I'll write out const styles equals stylesheet.create, and I'll pass in an object like so. Inside this object, we're going to eventually define a bunch of different groups of styles. For the first one that we're going to create right here, I'm going to create a new style property called text style, like so. So you can think of this as creating a grouping of different styling rules that we're going to apply to a name called text style. Now, just because I call this text style doesn't mean that it's going to automatically be applied to that text element. Instead, there's a very manual process we have to go through where we're going to use these different styles we create to apply them to different elements that we create inside of our component. We'll go into great detail in that later on, but for right now, let's just add in a little bit of code. Inside of this text style object, I'm going to assign a font size property of 30, like so. After that, we're then going to take the style that is generated by the stylesheet.create function and assign to the styles object, and we're going to apply it to that text element. So this is the very manual step that I just mentioned. So right here inside that text element, I'll say style, then it equals, then some curly braces, and I'll say styles.text style, like so. Okay, so that's a very manual step that we have to go through anytime we want to wire up some styling. We'll talk more about exactly what the relationship is between that code right there and the object we create down there, but for right now, let's just finish up our component file. So now for part 4, we're going to export the component we just created so we can use it somewhere else inside of our project. So to do so, at the very bottom of the file, I will write out export default, and then the name of our component that we created right here. So export default components screen, like so. And that's pretty much it. So we've now created our first component file. Now if we flip back over to our device, you'll notice that nothing on the screen over here has changed. So just because we created a component file doesn't mean that anything about our project is going to change right away. Instead, we have to make sure that we tell React Native that we want to show this component on the screen somehow. So let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll tackle that in the next video. We just created our first component, and now we need to tell React Native that we want this component to show up on the screen of our device. Until we do so, we're going to continue to see the default content of the home screen, which is right here. All right, so to tell React Native that we want to show this component on the screen, I'm going to go back to the app.js file that's inside of my root of my project directory. So here's the app.js file right here. Inside of here, you're going to see a little bit of existing code. So this code right here is some code that I added into our starter project. Remember, I mentioned that I added in just a little bit of code. This is pretty much it right here. So you'll notice there's not a whole lot going on. We'll talk about great details of what's going on inside of here over time, but once again, for right now, let's just try to get our new component to show up. So to do so, I'm going to first import the component we just created underneath the second import statement that is already inside of here. So right here, I'm going to say import component screen from, and then I'll list out a relative path to that file we just created. So by relative path, I mean that we need to essentially describe the path from our root project directory, which is where the app.js file is, to the component screen file. So I'll first put in /, which means look in the current working directory. So look in the root project directory, then go into the src folder. So I'll write out .src, then go into the screens folder, and then finally find the component screen file inside there. So components screen, like so. When we write out these import statements, we are not required to put on the path, or the extension of the file at the end of the path. So we do not have to put on .js like that. Okay, so now component screen right here is a direct reference to the function back over here that we just created. So now to make that component show up on the screen, we're going to add it to this stack navigator thing. The stack navigator is a little object that decides what content we're going to show on the screen at any given point in time. So we want to add in the component that we just created as an additional option for this stack navigator to show. So to do so, I'm going to find this first object right here, and right after home screen, I'll put in a comma. I'll then say components, like so, and components screen. So we've now added in our new component as a possible option for our stack navigator to show to the user. In the second object right here, you'll notice that there's an option called initial route name. That's a description or a configuration option that tells this navigator thing what the first component is that should be displayed. Right now it's set to home, which means that the stack navigator is going to find the home option right here and show that component on the screen first. So we're going to update that initial route name and tell it that we instead want to show this components option. So I will change home to C components. Make sure that components right here has the exact same spelling as components right there. If it's not the exact same, you're going to end up seeing an error message. Okay, so I'll save this file. And when I flip back over to my device, I'll see the component we just put together on the screen. So I see the text, this is the component screen. And I see that both on Android and my iOS device as well. You'll also notice that this text is kind of large. And that's because back inside of our component screen component, remember, we added in that font size of 30. If we start to change that font size, like let's say go up to 50 or so, you're going to see that text appear much larger. Or if we go all the way down to 10, it's going to be far smaller. I'm going to leave it at 30 for now. Okay, so we've now gone through the process of creating an entire React component and then wiring it up to this stack navigator thing inside of our app.js file. So now that we can see some content on the screen, let's take a quick pause. We're going to come back and we're going to do a quick little summary to kind of fill in a couple blanks about all the code that we just wrote. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last video, we wrote out a lot of code to get a component visible on the screen of our device. Now in this video, I want to take a quick pause and review some of the code that we've written out. In particular, I think that you might have a couple of different questions about the code we just wrote. So I want to go over a couple of different common questions right here and provide a couple of different answers for each one. So first off, what's that text thing that we imported inside of our component screen.js file? So I'm talking about this text thing right there. So that text thing is what we refer to as a primitive React element. Primitive React elements are provided by the React Native library. They allow us to show some amount of basic content to a user. So a text element is a primitive React element that shows some very basic text to a user. There are several other primitive elements that you need to be aware of, and we're going to look at these over time. Another primitive element is called a view. A view allows us to show kind of some general grouping element that can assemble different elements together and provide some styling to them. We also have a primitive element called an image that we can use to show an image to a user, or a button that shows a button. There are several other primitive elements you need to be aware of, and as I mentioned, we'll go over these over time. Okay, next up, what's that HTML looking stuff? We refer to it as JSX. So I'm talking specifically as this text tag right there. So this is what we refer to as JSX. This is not technically valid JavaScript. When you write out this code right here, it then passes into that React Native bundler that's running inside of our terminal. That bundler is using a tool called Babel to turn this JSX into some plain JavaScript code. So let me show you exactly what that line right there turns into when we convert it into normal JavaScript. So I'm going to copy that JSX element right there, the entire text element. I'm then going to go over to a website called babeljs.io. So this is a tool that is being used by the React Native bundler to turn our code into plain JavaScript, as opposed to the JSX we fed into it. On this page in particular, on the left-hand side, I can enter in some JSX, and it will show me the resulting JavaScript on the right-hand side. So I'm going to paste in that text element, and we'll see the result over here. So as you can see, a JSX element gets turned into a normal function call. Nothing weird about this whatsoever. It's just a normal function call to a function called react.createElement. So why do we use JSX? Well, as you're going to see very soon, when we put together React components, we frequently write out many different JSX elements like this one right here. If we were to write out all those different JSX elements instead as normal function calls like this, it would result in a component that's really hard to make changes to and really hard to modify and maintain over time. So instead, we make use of this JSX syntax just to make our lives as developers a little bit easier. That's pretty much it. We'll talk more about the rules around JSX very soon. Okay, so next big question you might have. Well, what's that app navigator or the navigator thing in general inside the app.js file? Okay, so back inside of app.js right here, remember we've got this create stack navigator function. So this navigator stuff that you see inside the app.js file, as I mentioned, I wrote this out ahead of time just to save us a little bit of complexity. All that navigator stuff is from a tool called React Navigation. This is a library that's used in a ton of different React Native projects for handling navigation. When we talk about navigation, we're really discussing about showing different content to the user, so making it appear as though there are different screens of content inside of our application. We're going to learn about React Navigation over time, and eventually we're going to wire all this stuff up from scratch on a future application. All right, final question. What's that styles thing back inside of our component file? All right, so back inside of component screen.js, I'm talking about this styles object right here. So just to be clear, because you might have seen a different way of applying styling to an element on some other React Native content, maybe another tutorial or a blog post, we are not strictly required to apply styling to an element using this stylesheet.create function call right here. The only reason we use stylesheet.create is that it will automatically validate the different styling rules that we're trying to apply to an element. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to pull my application back on the screen really quickly, and I want you to notice that I've got a font size property right here. So as you might guess, we're trying to use this rule to change the font size of our text element. In order to change the font size, we have to pass in a property that is specifically font size with a capital S. So if we change the spelling of this, or even the capitalization, the rule will not be applied correctly. So for example, if I change font size to have a lowercase s instead, and then save this, I'll very quickly see an error message appear. So it says font size is not a valid style property. This validation and the big red error message that you're seeing right here is provided by this stylesheet.create function. Now, just to show you a little technicality very quickly, I'm going to comment out that styles object. And then up here on my text element, rather than referencing styles.textstyle, I'm going to delete that and replace it with a plain JavaScript object. So notice that I now have two sets of curly braces. And then inside of here, I'll say font size of 30 like so. So if we want to, we can technically pass a styling object directly into a JSX element, and everything's going to work just fine. In addition, if we make a typo inside there, and I instead put in like font size with a lowercase s, we're still going to see not an error, not a big red error message, but we will see a warning down here at the bottom that has essentially the same message, something telling us, hey, we did something incorrectly. So this stylesheet.create function right here, we're only using because it shows a big red error message to us that tells us immediately, right away, that we did something poorly with styling inside of some given component. So it's an immediate signal to you and I that we need to go and figure out what we did incorrectly. Now, the only reason I show you this alternate way of applying styling is just to let you know that if we don't want to always have to create this big style sheet object down here, we always have a kind of escape hatch. And we'll talk about why we might want to pass what we refer to as an inline style right here over time. For now, I'm going to undo these changes I made. So I'm going to uncomment that, and I'll change this back to styles.textstyle. And I'm back to, oops, let me change the font size here as well. There we go, that's better. Okay, so that's the stylesheet.create function. Again, we use it because it's going to validate the different rules that we're trying to apply to some given element. All right, now that we've gone over a couple of different questions that you might have right here, let's continue working on our first little application in the next video.